Hi, my name is Siboniso Ngumalo. I'm a portfolio manager at the Old Mutual Investment Group. Today, we're going to talk about impact in listed markets. So, what are we talking? What does that mean? Well, actually, in South Africa, at Old Mutual, we have a very large alternative investments business that does impact investing across the country and in the continent. Now, impact investing is especially in terms of ESG, it's when you actually make a real impact on society. Now, if you think about that particular business, it builds schools, it funds wind farms, it funds turbines, and all of these wonderful things that make this a better planet. But actually, alternative investing is only around 2 to 3% of the market in South Africa, which means around 97% or so is actually in the listed markets. So therefore, unless we think about impact ESG in listed markets, actually we're unlikely to make a large impact on this. So why are we talking about ESG? Well, we need to bend the carbon curve. So this chart, a little bit of a complicated chart, it talks about global greenhouse gas emissions and warming scenarios. So if you look at on the y-axis, you've got the annual global greenhouse gas emissions, and obviously on the x-axis at the bottom, you've got the dates in terms of decades. Now we are in 2022 as we sit. So with no climate change policies, the expected outcomes lead all the way forward towards a world that is 4 to close to 5 degrees warmer. Now, why is that a problem? First of all, you've got to think about it. A world that is 4 to 5 degrees warmer, that's the average temperature of the world, which includes earth, land, which is surface, and water. Water takes a lot longer to get to that high. And so therefore, it would be hotter on land than that 4 to 5 degrees than it would be at the sea. That would have implications for agriculture. It would be implications for where we live. It would be implications for actually icebergs and coastal cities. And those implications, if you actually play them out to their full extent, would change the planet in a meaningful way and not in a good way for future generations. Fortunately, there have been some changes in terms of, look at the next thing about current policies, but current policies will do something, but actually they don't also change it meaningfully. Because the world still increases by close to 3 to 3.2 degrees, still very high, and still has consequences that we probably wouldn't like to see, especially for future generations. And so therefore, this is why we talk about bending the curve, because we've got to bend the curve to a 1.5 degree pathway. And so this is what science is telling us, that we need to aim for net zero by 2050. And I'll repeat this over and over again, because then that's a world that's going to heat up by about 1.5 degrees. Now, let us go forward. I'm a portfolio manager and an investor, and in our world, when clients give us money, that money is usually attached to some benchmark. In South Africa, it's attached to what's called the cap swix. So now remember what I talked about, the 1.5 degree world and net zero. So on the left, the MSCI World, that's a benchmark that fund managers in listed markets who manage global assets look at. So you can see the weighted carbon intensity on the left. 64.6 is the number in terms of what you would look for. But as you go to World and then EQI, MSCI ACWI, All Country World Index, you can see that both MSCI World and EQI are much higher than what the target is for a net zero world. Then when you get to emerging markets, that's even substantially higher, and South Africa, which is the JSE Cap Swix. Why? Well, developing nations, emerging markets, use a lot of carbon to actually build their economies. If you think about the source of our energy, which I'm going to talk about, the cost to development is that you need energy, and most of that energy comes from fossil fuels. So therefore, for us to achieve those global targets, it's a little bit tough for emerging markets. The fund that I'm part of the team of running, the Mutual Investors Fund, has an even higher carbon intensity than the JSE benchmark. And I'll talk to why, because of the certain companies that we hold in that specific fund. Now, when we come back to South Africa, we've got to understand when we talk about these greenhouse emissions, there are 3 scopes and 3 categories. There's scope 1 emissions. Those are direct emissions from the operation. So if you're a company, those are actually the things that you emit as a company in your production of whatever services and business that you are doing. Scope 2 is indirect from purchased energy, and then Scope 3 are all your other activities that are associated, which is you traveling and going to see clients or whatever it is that the company actually does. Now, what's important when it comes back to South Africa is that our Scope 2 emissions are high because of where our power comes from, which is from Eskom. And Eskom generates most of its power from coal. And so therefore, the reason why our benchmark is as high as it is primarily because of Scope 2 emissions, because of where we produce our power from. And so therefore, the source of our energy makes decarbonization extremely hard in South Africa. If you look at the actual pollution in South Africa, there are two chief culprits. Eskom at 42%, Sasol, the listed company, at 11%. So half of the nation's greenhouse emissions come from two companies. And I mean, yes, South Africa, on the left, you see an article there, world leaders hail South Africa's landmark Green Deal, where we're going to get about $130 billion to fund greening our economy. But actually, that's not enough for what we need to do. On the other side, you can see Sasol and Eskom achieve a dismal result in emissions benchmark. So we've got a problem. And our problem is coal and the source of our energy. The same benchmark. Remember, I'm a fund manager. Whenever we get money from clients, clients say, can you beat this benchmark? Then you're adding value for me. And so therefore, we target the benchmark. Now, in South Africa, you can see the JSE Cap Swix has been trending positively. So the carbon intensity actually is decreasing. So that's good. But my point in this particular slide is that the 1.5 degree aligned target is very far away, and it's going to take structural intervention to get anywhere close to that target in South Africa. When you live in the developed world, their benchmarks are actually very large. And so as a global investor, you've got an option to invest in about 16,000 or so companies, which means you can be exclusionary. So you can decide, I don't want to invest in tobacco stocks or coal stocks or oil stocks because they're not that material in your benchmark. When you live in South Africa, that's a little bit more challenging because the chief emitters actually are in the benchmark. And if you ignore them, you might not fulfill the primary ambition that clients have given you money for, which is to grow their wealth. Let's talk about that. So if we look at South Africa, if we look at the South African benchmark, the Cap Swix that we measure ourselves by, and so does the rest of the industry in listed markets, you can see the top 10 contributors in terms of carbon intensity actually make up 80%. That's a lot. So we've got 10 companies that make up 80% of the countries in terms of the benchmark of the carbon intensity. Now, what I want you to pay attention to, I've mentioned Sasol. Sasol is 40% of that. So that's half of that. But the rest of those companies are interesting companies. They're companies in the mining sector. And sometimes we get this argument from people in terms of when we have these debates about sustainability, about ESG, someone says, well, actually, why don't you just stop investing in Sasol or stop investing in the mining sector? Yeah, but what's going to happen to those companies? What's going to happen to the impact that they have in society and in the country? And we're going to talk about that later. So what I'm saying, it's easy to say, let's stop doing this or stop being exclusionary. But actually, the practical implications are a little bit more challenging. When we talk about, I love this particular cartoon, when we talk about climate change threatens our existence, you can see the crowd there, very bored, not interested. And the professor there wipes the board and says, climate change threatens our investments. Now you can see they are alert and alive. And so therefore, we've got to come back to this idea. Climate change is threatening our investments. I'm a fund manager. My job is to take clients' money and grow it. That's when we do a great job. But there's a dilemma here. And I've picked this particular period very well. So remember the companies I showed you that were the problem children in terms of carbon emissions. Now let's look at what my job is, which is to generate investment returns. If you go from 1 April 2020 to 31 December 2021, you can see the best performing share is Sasol. It made returns 600%. That's a material performance. Now, it was from a very low base post the COVID crisis, but 600% is an astonishing return. MTN is next with almost 300%, but MTN is generating those returns because it's got a large business in Nigeria, which is, again, an oil economy. Then you've got the mining companies that follow suit, which all those mining companies that we look at and say, hey, you are the chief polluters. You are the chief emitters of greenhouse gases. Look at those investment returns. Remember, when a client gives us money, that money is linked to a dream. That client wants to retire well someday. That client wants to send their kids to university, buy something, buy a house, whatever it is that they want to do. But there's a dream attached to that. And that dream is fulfilled when we grow that client's wealth. Investing in those companies that we have clearly seen are chief emitters actually has been highly profitable in this period. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with greenhouse emissions and yet still fulfilling our primary objectives as fund managers of growing clients' wealth? Let's talk about Sasol, because clearly Sasol is a problem child when it comes to greenhouse emissions. Now, Sasol beneficiates oil, and so therefore Sasol in general has a rather simple business model that's very, very complicated though in execution. So if we look at Sasol, the history of Sasol's share price, you take the Brent crude oil price, you multiply by the rand, and actually you can calculate what the ratio should be. That green line in about 2019, you can see the green line decoupling from what Sasol's theoretical price should be. That green line decoupled, one, because Sasol went to Louisiana to build a very massive project. They took on a lot of debt, and that caused a few issues. And obviously also we're getting ESG concerns, and so arguably there might be an ESG discount, as the world says we don't like investing in companies like this. So yes, Sasol did 600%, but according to this particular ratio, actually Sasol, and especially at current oil prices, could still materially appreciate. So what do I do as a fund manager? Do I sit there and say, this company is not good and I'm not going to invest in it? And yet knowing that my clients have said, hey, I'm giving you my money so you can grow it. And this could be one of the best ideas to grow it in. Because you can see the distribution of investment returns is not linear. It's not like saying, I'm going to give up the 600% and I'll find it elsewhere. It's difficult in a market like South Africa. So this is a fund manager's dilemma. And that's why in South Africa, this is very difficult to be exclusionary. Now, ESG has consequences, which is interesting because we haven't thought about this that much. The other day, I saw an article in the Business Day in South Africa, which talked about how Standard Bank was being one of the largest banks in South Africa, was being questioned about why they were funding oil projects. It's a question. It's not a question just in South African banks, it's a question globally. And so therefore, as companies in the oil space, in the coal space are being questioned, why are you investing? Why are you investing in dirty energy that's not going to be there in the future? The one thing that happens there is that then we've seen a decline in capital expenditure or investment in oil in this particular instance, and coal too. But we've seen a decline in spending, which means no new wells are being dug, et cetera, which means in the future, the supply of oil actually is going to decline. Now, there are consequences to this. So in theory, this is good. In practice, it has consequences. And we must take you back to Economics 101, when I went to a wonderful university and I learned about this particular chart. So on the x-axis, we have got a price, and on the y-axis at the bottom, we've got a quantity. So we've got a line there that's sloping called demand today. Now, we're going to look at the oil price in basics, Economic 101. So we've got demand and supply, and let's pretend that the oil price is around $90 at particular demand and supply. Now remember, what did I say in the previous slide? There's less investment in oil, and so therefore, what is happening to supply? Supply is declining. Demand though, the world is growing, the world is getting bigger, and it's consuming more and more oil. That is not changing yet. Yes, now there are obviously more green energy sources that are coming on stream, but they're not as big as actually what it takes to replace oil. And so therefore, Economics 101 teaches us that if supply becomes less while demand stays the same, the price is going to be forced up. So the question we ask ourselves, is ESG creating higher energy prices? And so far, the answer is yes. And that's a dilemma. Because that means, for me as an investor whose job is to hunt for ways to grow clients' wealth, actually investing in a company, in coal and oil companies, has proven rather profitable over the last while. But because of this. And so therefore, what are we saying here? Saying, hey, this transition has to be thought through carefully. We've got to be patient and be smart about how we do, because there are consequences. because none of us like higher oil prices. And yet, on the other hand, we're saying, hey, we want a more sustainable and a more green world, which is right. But the path towards there is likely to cause some pain. So as an investor, this is challenging. We spend a lot of time, which I've also spent, talk about environmental. There are social aspects to this and governance. But let's talk about social, especially when it comes to Sasol. Now, Sasol is a fascinating company. Again, in my word here, Sasol is a very large social impact, and we need to talk about that. So let's look at Sasol's social impact. Contributes almost 5% to GDP in the country. That's material. The market cap, I think this was last week of January, was around 217 billion rand. It reinvests about 16 billion rand a year in the country to sustain operations. It pays about 10 billion rand in direct taxes. That's going to grow as the profits start growing again. Invests 1.2 billion in research and development. It's a level 4 BEE company. Its black-owned business spend is 23 billion. Black women-owned business spend is 15.8 billion. There's an impact. It pays 34 billion in wages and benefits. It employs 28,000 people, 29,000 people across the world. So therefore, when people say, hey, how can you invest in a company like Sasol? Why don't we just shut it down? We're saying, hey, that's far more complicated than you think. Yes, there are environmental questions, but it's E, S, and G. We've got to consider the governance questions and the social questions. The social being, in this particular instance, a little bit important, and no one thinks about that. Because if we took all of this away, where would those jobs go? Where would this environment be? So we've got to think carefully about just making, and it's complicated. So therefore, in its complexity, how do we deal with it? Knowing that we can't just say, shut it down or don't invest in it. Well, actually, we've been engaging with Sasol. We have to be responsible investors, and we are responsible investors. So how do you deal with this? So here is a journey that we have taken with a company like Sasol, starting in around 2014, where we saw this dilemma. We saw the fact that Sasol is necessary to the economy. If you took it away from the economy today, we would all know it. Just like if you took Eskom away from the economy, we would all know it. And how do I know that that is true? Well, when Eskom shuts down your lights, you know. And so therefore, it's not that simple to say, don't invest, because we still need these companies, and we will need them for a long time still. I mean, the Eskom example makes me laugh, because it's a bit like we always sit there and say, we make these comments, but we don't think about the fact that we also contribute to the need for these companies. So in terms of Sasol, in terms of stewardship and engagement, talking to them for years and actually engaging with the company about directionally, where are you going? How are you solving your problems? And the company acknowledges their role. But they are crafting a story that actually says, hey, this is our path. This is where we're going for a just transition. Because in a country like South Africa, the transition we have a very high unemployment rate. So for us to say, actually, Sasol, all your 29,000 employees, just shut the thing down. And that's just the employees employed directly by Sasol. Sasol has many other indirect employment opportunities down the value chain. And so therefore, the question is, hey, in a country like South Africa, it's not that simple. You can't just act like you are in Europe, where you can say, stop, and then the government will subsidize. We have other issues in South Africa. And so our transition has to be just and consider the impact on society. And now coming up is a variety of very different ways in terms of how our engagement with Sasol has been. And with this engagement, we have seen progress. We think Sasol is trending in the right direction. They are disclosing a little bit more and communicating their intention. And that's a good thing. The other side of it is that in terms of stewardship and Sasol, you can see here the company issued a statement. It says ordinary resolutions proposed by Sasol shareholders, Old Mutual Investment Group, and then some of our other competitors. This is not just about us as Old Mutual Investment Group. This is about an industry which invests clients' capital into a company like Sasol. And that industry has to act in unison to actually collaborate in discussing with Sasol and making sure that we are dealing with this with the patience that's required and yet getting to the appropriate destination. And as an industry, we are. I suppose the question is, remember what I said at the beginning? The net zero transition is important, But actually, when a client gives me money, the client is giving me money so that I can beat a benchmark. So therefore, in South Africa, if we want to solve this in any way, we have to think about the benchmarks that we are using for people like me who need to grow clients' capital. So in Europe, yeah, they can say, hey, we want a benchmark which has 0 in primary producers, like Sasol. Says, no, we don't want to invest in that. In South Africa, what's the roadmap? Because in South Africa, we're not going to go there. It doesn't make sense as us, as a country, and as an economy. So we need a roadmap of how we're going to get our way there. Also, what is interesting about Europe is that they had a little bit colder winter, and guess what happened? They turned back all the coal electricity producers and used more gas, etc. And so we're not quite there. We're not ready as a world for the world that we want to be. We're heading towards there. But I'm just saying, in South Africa, we need to start thinking about our benchmarks. What's our starting point of the CAP 6, the JSE index that I'm measured on? Is it 30%, 40%, 50% in terms of what our ESG requirement is? In South Africa, in Old Mutual, we have an ESG fund which is at 40%. Because again, you can't just go to 0. There are consequences to that. What's the decline rate? Comes back to that roadmap question. The decline rate in Europe is 7%, so they're clear. They're like, okay, this is how we are declining, this is how we are getting to that net 0. In South Africa, it's going to be different. It's going to be slower, it's going to take a little bit more time, and it's actually going to have to be managed a little bit differently. Why? Because again, South Africa is a different economy, a different country. It's got its own social consequences and social structures that need to be considered. So a just transition, at the end of the day, it has to be a multi-stakeholder dialogue. So for us as Old Mutual Investment Group, we're saying, well, we are partnering with some of our competitors, our clients, and etc., to actually continue this conversation. So as we close here, what was my message? Yes, we need to aim for net 0. That is a truth. How we get there in South Africa is going to be a little bit more challenging because of the source of our energy and the source of the largest companies in our index. That's also a truth. Those companies, for a country like South Africa, are big employers, are big investors, are very important to the structure of this country, and also given our economic condition and situation, those companies matter. So ESG also has a social aspect to it. We talk a lot about the environmental, we need to talk more about the social. The fact that there are these dilemmas means that we have to have dialogue, we have to be patient, we have to talk, we have to have a roadmap and think through these things. And I think finally, collaboration is going to be needed by all. It's easy to make certain companies the holy cows that we need to shoot down, but actually we can't do that. To do well in South Africa and have an impact just requires us to all collaborate and open our minds and engage.